Chapter 18, A Turn of Events. After eating a quick snack of several buttered rolls that Martha had grabbed off her mother's table, Caleb and Peter were able to round up 3 horses, and then the 3 were ready to leave. 20 minutes later, they had made their way the first and easiest leg of their journey. When they reached the old highway bridge that was nearest to their settlement along the creek, Caleb stopped and pulled out his map from his backpack. The afternoon skies had become increasingly overcast since noon. As a cold front had begun to roll in, Caleb noted a chill in the air as he stopped to check his map. "I believe this is where we should begin," muttered Caleb, looking over his map. "Here was the bridge for the old Highway 234 marked, here on the map," said Caleb, tracing the highway marked on the map. "Then follow the river, that way," he said, pointing with his finger along the river to the southwest. "I sure hope you two brought some warm clothes with you. It's starting to get chilly," observed Martha, reaching into her backpack and removing a small sweater. "I'll have you know I really had to twist my mother's arm to allow me to come along," said Martha, poking Caleb's arm while he was looking at the map. "I'll bet you did," said Caleb, looking up towards Martha. "I'm glad you wanted to come along." "Hey Caleb, where did you find that map?" asked Peter. He was looking over his shoulder at the map that Caleb had taken out of his backpack. "I've never seen any map like that one before and hey, wait a minute, that's an old map. It has a year written on it, 2039 on the back. Where did you get that?" quizzed Peter. "That map's almost 100 years old, yet it looks brand new." Martha carefully maneuvered her horse over to the side of Caleb to get a better look at the map. "Caleb, what is it you're not telling us?" asked Martha, waving her hand over in front of Caleb's face to get his attention. "Where did you get that map?" Caleb looked up at the bridge, mumbling softly, as he then turned and looked over at his friends Peter and Martha. "Well," insisted Martha, "are you going to explain to us how you got that map?" Caleb hesitated. "I promised my brother Stephen the first wouldn't tell anyone," Caleb explained. "We were going to tell everyone about it later on, but we were afraid that Elder Zachariah would want us to bury it up again." Peter and Martha suddenly looked confused. "Bury it up again? What are you talking about, Caleb?" asked Peter. Caleb folded the map up carefully, returning it to his backpack before continuing. "Can you promise not to tell?" asked Caleb. Martha and Peter nodded their heads. "Come on, Caleb, we're your friends, remember, we share things," teased Peter. "Last fall, Stephen and I found a buried cave a few miles northeast of here along the river," explained Caleb. "It must have been buried there since before the time of the Great Cataclysm and before the tidal wave destroyed this area. We found books, magazines, first aid gear, clothing, and other things that were stored inside, all sealed up tightly, since before the cataclysm. I found this map in there, along with hundreds and hundreds of books." "Wow, that's amazing," whispered Martha. "I can see why you and Stephen wanted to keep it a secret." "Caleb, man, you got to stop with all these secrets you're keeping. I thought we were friends," said Peter jokingly. Martha glared at Peter. "Cut it out, Peter. He's right to keep it a secret. If one of the older council members found out about this cave, like my grandfather, Elder Zachariah, or my father or your father," continued Caleb, pointing at himself and then Martha. "Or my dad," added Peter. "That's right. They would all want to bury the cave back up like it was and forget all about it, like it never happened," said Caleb. "It's just like the stories that Mrs. Daniels tells all the time in school about the old days in America and how things were so much different then. She tells us how lucky we all are to have survived and be able now to have a fresh start," said Martha. "Or like the stories that Elder Jonas tells about how people suffered from hunger and sickness and that there were so many sinful people. It's just like the story in the Bible of Sodom and Gomorrah. Elder Jonas says that the cataclysm was God's judgment on all mankind for the sin that was in the world," said Peter. "But that's just it," exclaimed Caleb. "That's what bothers me." "What do you mean, Caleb?" asked Martha. Caleb explained, "Sure, there were things in those days that were bad, but not everything was as bad as they tell us. People could travel around the world in huge air machines, they rode around in cars on paved roads over long distances, and they could communicate instantly with each other over long distances. And Caleb reached into his backpack for one of the picture magazines he brought with him from the cave and held it up for Peter and Martha to see. They were even able to send men in spaceships to walk on the planet Mars. Peter reached across and grabbed the picture magazine out of Caleb's hand and then proceeded to shuffle and read through all the pages, amazed at all he saw. Martha watched and looked on as Peter held up the magazine each time he found another amazing picture. Martha turned and looked directly at Caleb. "So, are you saying that everything we've been told was a lie? That what happened long ago wasn't God's judgment on man for all his sins?" she asked. "I don't know, Martha. I just have this feeling that we don't know everything, that we don't have the whole story. I see these things in my dreams that don't always make sense. Sometimes I see visions of things that happened in the past and the faces of those who lived before. Then sometimes I see people I don't know, and visions of things that have yet to happen," said Caleb. "Sort of like this vision you had of the people who hide in the woods?" asked Peter. "Yes, exactly." The three were quiet until Martha broke the silence. "Let me get this right then. You believe that the expedition team, with your father and brother, and both our fathers too, are in danger because of the visions that you've had about the people in the woods, and you think that this map is going to help you find them so you can warn them, all because of some sketchy clues you received from the old Caleb you saw in your visions?" asked Martha. There was silence as Caleb's attention seemed to drift off. Peter quietly handed over the picture magazine to Martha. Caleb let out a heavy sigh. "Yeah, I guess that's about right. Seems like a crazy idea when you put it that way, doesn't it?" remarked Caleb solemnly. Caleb turned to face Peter and Martha. "Look, remember what you told me a few days ago, Martha? You said to believe in myself. Well, I'm trying to do that right now. 'Cause sometimes this all seems, well, crazy," said Caleb. "Well, why are we just sitting here then? Show us the way to go," insisted Peter, looking at Martha and Caleb. "I'm in." "Me too," chimed Martha, noticing Caleb's worried look. "What's the matter? You know we're all going to be in a lot of trouble for this, right?" asked Caleb. "I didn't want you two to have to get involved or suffer at all in following along with me on this. If you want to turn back now and go home, I'll understand." Peter and Martha looked at each other and nodded their heads together. "Not a chance, Caleb. We're all friends. We are in this together. Let's go," they said in unison. Caleb and his friends had been riding for nearly 2 hours straight, carefully following the many twists and turns of the creek as it led them southward. Occasionally, Caleb would stop and double-check their progress with his map. It was after several of these twists and turns that 3 of them came upon long, partially elevated road bridge crossing over the creek. Again, Caleb stopped to check his map, gazing up at the afternoon sky, which seemed to be getting cloudier as the day went on. "If any of you see a marker or sign around here with a number on it, holler," yelled Caleb, carefully looking up and down the old roadway for any signs of markers. Peter could be heard from a distance as he rode his horse down the old highway. "I see a marker, Caleb. It says Ayton Road," he yelled. Caleb opened his map. "That's it then. We've found it. We are almost there. We only have about another mile or so, then we will reach another bridge," he said. Caleb felt a sudden sense of urgency as they continued along the creek for nearly an hour. As minute by minute went by, he looked up at the sky. He could see that the weather was starting to change as the winds had begun to pick up and the clouds began to darken in the skies above. "We have to pick up our pace, guys," yelled Peter from the back. "I'm guessing we only have about 3 or 4 hours of daylight left." It was when the 3 of them reached the next and smaller bridge that a strange sense of déjà vu came over Caleb, and he felt that sick feeling swelling up inside his stomach. "I've been here before," he thought to himself. Caleb looked over at Martha, who had been riding steadily since they left the village. "Do you want to stop and rest a minute, Martha? We can if you want to," he asked. Martha shook her head. "I'm just fine, unless you guys need a break." "Yeah, I do need a break," said Peter, stopping his horse and getting off. He tied it up to a nearby tree. "I will be right back. Don't go anywhere without me." "Don't worry, we won't," joked Martha, as her and Caleb both got down from their horses. Martha found a clearing near a couple of tall oak trees, then reached into her pack and pulled out a couple of small bags as she sat down next to one of the larger trees. Caleb followed Martha and then sat down across from her. Looking over, he noticed Martha yawning. "You okay?" "I'm just great, but a little hungry," she said. Martha reached into one of her bags and pulled out a smaller sack of grapes that she had brought along. "Here, have some," she tossed Caleb a bunch. "Thanks," said Caleb, devouring them instantly. "Wow, I guess I didn't realize I was so hungry. What else do you have in there?" he said. Martha giggled. "What, a 16-year-old boy who didn't bring along any food for a trip?" Martha teased. "Aren't those visions of yours saying anything to help you keep from starving to death out here?" she asked, laughing. "Sorry," said Caleb, feeling a bit sheepish. "I'm just kidding," said Martha as they both started laughing. "Your mom is really going to hate me when we get back. I can see it now," said Caleb. "She's going to say, 'Sarah, your son is a bad influence on my daughter Martha,'" said Caleb, mimicking his Aunt Rebecca. Martha started laughing even harder as Caleb continued. "And my dad will probably say, 'Uriah, you have to discipline your boy,'" added Martha, imitating her father's voice. The two of them continued their conversation for several minutes, enjoying the time alone so much they nearly lost track of the fact that Peter had not yet returned from his break. It wasn't until they heard the most awful scream, coming from a few dozen yards downstream, that they realized Peter wasn't back yet. Caleb jumped up and immediately grabbed for his backpack, pulling out one of the large knives that he had brought along with him from the cave. Martha shoved her bags of food back into her backpack, also jumping up to her feet. She tried to listen again for any more sounds from Peter that would tell them which direction he was in, but it was quiet for a few seconds. "Peter, where are you?" yelled Caleb and Martha, waiting for a response. Then they heard a slight whimpering sound. "That way," said Caleb, pointing to a spot downstream. He took off at a run. Martha followed. It took a minute or two of shoving aside large branches and vines as Caleb used his knife like a machete to hack his way through the brush to reach his friend Peter. When he and Martha found him, he was sitting on the wet sand near the side of the creek, holding onto his left leg, which he had pulled off his left shoe and sock, and was apparently trying to get a good look at his ankle. "Peter, what happened?" yelled Martha. "I got bit by a snake," he said, pointing to the one that was still crawling a few yards away. Caleb saw the snake and then grabbed a long tree branch from the ground and walked over to where the snake was trying to make its exit. "Caleb, be careful," insisted Martha. Caleb lifted up the branch high into the air and smacked the snake hard on the head with the large end of the branch, which seemed to stun the snake, but only momentarily as it continued attempting to flee. He repeated his effort a second time, only bringing it down much harder on the snake, which nearly cut it into two. Then Caleb held the snake down with the blunt end of his stick, while simultaneously cutting the snake's head off with his knife. "It's a copperhead!" Caleb hollered as he grabbed and held up the snake's tail. Martha crouched down on the sand next to Peter, gently taking a hold of Peter's leg. "We have to get a better look at this, Peter. How are you feeling?" she asked, motioning Caleb over. "It hurts so much. I was just messing around near the water, and I thought I saw a fish, then wham, it struck at me. It was so fast, I didn't have time to jump or get out of his way," exclaimed Peter. Martha reached up and took the knife from Caleb's hand and cut a small piece of Peter's pant leg away to get a closer look. "I can see where it bit you, Peter. It's on the backside of your calf," she said, as she continued cutting off the rest of the material. "See the two little holes, right there," said Martha, pointing for Caleb to see. Caleb stooped over to get a closer look, and then he could clearly see two tiny holes about an inch apart and roughly 6 inches above Peter's ankle on the back of his leg. "It's starting to turn a little red too," noticed Caleb. "Here," said Caleb, reaching down for the piece of material from Peter's pant leg. He cut it into several long strips and tied them together, then handed them to Martha. "Good idea," said Martha, tying the strand of material tightly around Peter's leg just above the bite marks. Martha then noticed Peter starting to break a slight sweat. She stood up and motioned Caleb to follow her. "Caleb, we must get Peter help." He's going to need medical help for this that we can't give him, said Martha. What do you think we should do? Caleb went and grabbed his backpack, and reaching in he removed a small red and white bag. It was one of the small first aid kits he found in the cave. He dropped it onto the ground next to Peter and opened it up. Peter, where did you get this? Asked Martha. Where do you think? Said Caleb as he shuffled through the contents of the bag. He remembered seeing some items in here that could be helpful. Right there, said Martha, grabbing a large roll of elastic bandage material. This is good. I'll wrap it up for him, but I'm going to need a small stick about 1.5 feet long. Caleb looked around and grabbed the stick that he had used to kill the snake and cut a small section of it the length Martha asked for. How do you know so much about snake bites, Martha? Asked Caleb, handing her the stick. My dad was bitten by a snake a few years ago, and I watched my mom treat it for him. It was almost the same spot as where Peter was bit too, she said. He'll be okay for a little while, but we got to get help. Martha and Caleb stood up to clean themselves off. As Caleb was shoving the first aid kit back into his backpack, he felt a tugging on his shirt sleeve. Caleb, Martha whispered nervously, it looks like we've got company. As Caleb looked at Martha, she pointed behind him, and Caleb slowly turned around to see 4 boys quietly watching them from above. The 4 boys appeared to be nearly the same age as Caleb and his friends, standing about 50 feet away on a slight hill above the shoreline. Their clothes were similar, and their hair was long and dark, just like Caleb's, but their arms and faces were all different. It was nearly like those in his vision. Their arms and faces were all painted with varied shades of green, browns, and yellows, all colors to match the trees of the forest around them. Caleb turned around and stared at Martha with a puzzled expression. The people of the woods, he muttered softly.
You have been listening to Caleb Elgin, The Rise of the Clans by David E. Farmer. Also available on Amazon Kindle. More chapters coming soon. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.